I sound on. Super. Well, first of all, could I just echo John T's welcome? You're all very welcome. Whether you are Christian or not, go to this church or not. I imagine we all have life and
all have different levels of
interest and knowledge in this topic. In spite of John T's wonderful introduction, I should mention from the start, I am a teacher. I'm not really an expert in this topic. This is an undergraduate student. I've done some reading, and that's about it. So I don't pretend to be an expert, but I've done a bit of looking into it. And it's a vast topic that's occupied the careers of loads of people over the years. So in 45 minutes, I don't really expect to fully do it justice. But I do hope for each of us tonight, basically, this talk will help us, whether we're Christian or not. This whole talk was inspired by a comment I heard in a Bible study a few months ago. We're looking at John's Gospel, and the person asked, well, how do we know what John describes actually happened? And the person's question was a very good one. It basically showed that in order to trust and follow Jesus, it's really important that we can trust the Bible and the Bible's account. The Bible is the basis of so much in Christianity, so its trustworthiness is really important. Equally, the reverse of that is true. If the Bible can be trusted, one can, and then logically should, follow Jesus. That decision, of course, is a personal one, but I hope this talk puts each of us here in a more informed position to make that decision. Trust is a really important part of history, as history is all about things we can't recreate or test. As a teacher once taught a pupil who didn't believe in William the Conqueror, and being his teacher was really, really tricky. But he had a point. History can't be proven. It must be trusted. And some historical accounts can be trusted, and others cannot. And the question we're considering tonight is, what of those two categories do the Gospels fall into? So what is the purpose of this talk? The purpose of the talk is simply for us together to consider the four Gospels, the four biblical accounts of Jesus' life, and to consider whether they are trustworthy and what the implications of that trustworthiness for us is. In doing so, I genuinely hope to be even-handed. It would be easier to present a very one-sided case, but actually that wouldn't really set you up well to consider that question for yourselves. So to do so, we really need both sides. So, to start off, it was working earlier. There we are. So to start off, it's worth considering, why does this all matter? Now, given that you've given up a Friday evening to come here, hopefully you already think it matters somewhat. Or maybe you just heard about Helen's wonderful cheese and wine. It's good to see and to have spoken to a range of people tonight, and I don't know where you all stand on this topic. As mentioned on the flyer, everyone is welcome to this talk. If you're a Christian, the Bible is the bedrock of our faith, regardless of our denomination. The Bible itself describes itself as the Word of God. 2 Timothy says all Scripture is God-breathed. That's why each Sunday Bibles preached from our pulpit. It's why it's on our windows, on our walls, and it's why our doctrines and beliefs are based on it. It contains the accounts of Jesus' crucifixion, by which we believe we're saved, and the accounts of his resurrection, by which we can know we are saved. Now, if you're not a Christian, you're equally welcome here. The claims of Christianity are massive and life-changing. The concept of eternal life alone is vast. If we represented our lifespan as a single pencil dot on the massive white walls of this church, that pencil dot would be too small to represent our lives, and the walls would be too small to represent eternity. So the Bible's central truth that we need saving, that we can be saved through Jesus, and that this saving reconciles us to God and puts us with him in heaven for eternity, is truly life-changing. For those of us who go to this church and were there last Sunday, it was really lovely to see 5 people from all different walks of life being confirmed and baptized in that service. And every single one of them spoke of their lives being changed by becoming a Christian. Now, of course, there's a very valid counter-argument to all of that, which is that salvation is claimed by many other religions as well. And eternal life, while very much a comfort, may just be a claim, not a truth. So where is the proof? Christianity is a rational, evidence-based religion, and its main claimed evidence is in the Bible. The Bible, particularly those 4 gospel accounts of Jesus' life, speak of God becoming a man as Jesus, Jesus providing God's teaching to humanity, Jesus proving his God through miracles, Jesus dying on the cross so we can be saved, and, as I mentioned, Jesus rising from the dead to prove we can be saved. These are huge, life-changing claims, and they're drawn from the Bible. So that's why the historical trustworthiness of the Bible is vital to the Christian and the non-Christian alike. Now that we've established how important this topic is, let's explore 3 critical questions that should help each of us to consider how trustworthy the Bible is. And the questions I'd like us to consider for the next half an hour or so are, firstly, when were the Gospel accounts written? If they're written significantly after Jesus' life, that could weaken their accuracy. It would suggest that the Gospel writers weren't using eyewitness testimony. Secondly, who wrote them? And what were their sources? This is actually a critical part of their trustworthiness. The Gospels didn't originally contain in their text the name of the people who wrote them. But it would be helpful to know, if possible, who wrote them, and ideally looking at hints of what sources, which eyewitnesses they used. And then thirdly, the most important question, looking at the text itself, are the contents historically reliable? That's the most directly important question we'll consider. So let's take each of those questions in turn. Firstly, when were the Gospels written? This is an important question. If Jesus died around the year 33 AD, and if the Gospels were, say, written after the 90s AD, it's quite unlikely there'll be any eyewitnesses left to be used as a source for the writing. It would also invalidate Luke's claim to have used people who are from the first eyewitnesses, as well as challenging the traditional authorships of the Gospels. Now, of course, we're never going to be able to date the Gospels precisely. There's no publication date on the back or whatever. Non-Christian scholars tend to put them in the second half of the 1st century, particularly the 70s, 80s, and 90s AD. So about 30 to 60 years after Jesus' life. Much of their reasoning is that Jesus predicts the fall of the temple in Jerusalem, which we know happened in 70 AD. Their logic runs that prophecy is not possible, Jesus' prophecy is correct, therefore that must have been written, included, after 70 AD. Now, Christian scholars aren't locked in by that prior assumption, so they tend to date the Gospels a bit earlier, quite often before 70 AD. But regardless of the dating debate, even that last decade of the 90s is, or would still be, within some people's living memory. I wouldn't want to make assumptions about any of your ages, but I imagine many of you can remember events between 30 and even up to 60 years ago. For those of us in this church family, you might remember we're celebrating one family member's 60th wedding anniversary. And I imagine she can remember quite vividly that day, and maybe even some of the things that were said in her wedding day back in the 60s. Now, if that's true of a wedding, that would be even truer of Jesus' disciples. Encountering Jesus was so life-changing that his followers would abandon their entire careers and follow him. And also, it's quite normal for rabbis' followers to memorize their teachings and to take notes of them. And it's quite likely that Jesus' disciples, therefore, did the same. So we can see this up here. So, top left, we've got Paul's letter to the Corinthians, which is approximately dated to 54 AD. So only about 20 years or so after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. Although the dating of Luke depends whether you are a Christian scholar or a non-Christian scholar, it is later, almost certainly. But you can see the text of the two is actually very, very similar. So it suggests that actually there hasn't been much change over time at all. And if anything, hints at intentional memorization. Indeed, one really interesting idea about the dating of the Gospels is that the Gospels started to be written down precisely because those eyewitnesses, through persecution or naturally, were dying off. So they needed to get it down before the last ones passed away. Now, of course, it is perfectly possible that after the Gospels were first written, then they were changed later, but that's something we'll consider in the third question. So having spoken a bit about the dating, having seen that doesn't really pose a significant problem, we'll go on to the interesting question of who wrote them. Now, as I mentioned, this question is unlikely to directly affect the trustworthiness of the Gospels, historically speaking, because they didn't, in their text, name their authors. But it is interesting and relevant because our Bibles do assume that those traditional authors are in fact the authors. And also it's really interesting if we can spot some of the sources they may have used. I should mention the ascriptions. So the authors are quite early. So Papias of Hierapolis, who lived in 60 to 130 AD, speaks of Mark writing Mark and Matthew writing Matthew. Papias' work is actually fragmentary. He might have written a lot more, but we don't know that for certain. But definitely he mentioned Mark and Matthew. A few years later, we have Irenaeus, who was Bishop of Lyon, and he's already defending, in his work against heresies, the four Gospels, and just mentions their names just in passing, as though it's something his readers would already know. Also, in the mid-2nd century, you start having gospel harmonies being formed. So that's when, rather than having all four gospels, you have someone who merges them together into one account. The earliest one that we know of for certain, there may have been earlier ones, is the Diates Saron in about 60 to 170 AD. I'm not good at Greek, but I've been told Diates Saron translates as out of four. So this gospel harmony already is viewing just the four Gospels as authoritative. So we can see basically the ascriptions are very early. So within about 100 years at the most of them being written. Let's dive into each one in turn. We'll start with Mark, because in spite of the order in our Bible, Mark is generally considered to be the earliest. Now, Mark was not a disciple, but the same Papias tells us that he was an interpreter to Simon Peter. And Papias says Mark wrote down accurately as many things as he recalled from memory. Again, that theme of memorization. Papias also mentions that Peter taught anecdotes, and Mark in his writing preserves those anecdotes. So that's the source, so Simon Peter, according to Papias. And if Papias is correct, that would match a few features of Mark's Gospel. Firstly, Mark's Gospel tends to clump together events more for thematic reasons than chronological ones. If you look at the other Gospels, they're fairly neatly in order. Mark can jump around a bit, which would match Simon Peter's anecdotal way of teaching. Secondly, Mark, from the very start of his Gospel, has a very strong focus on Peter. You can see that up here. So Simon is Simon Peter here. So Jesus saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, according to Mark. Matthew, in that same passage, very similar, but just as Jesus saw two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother. That's just one example. There's lots of examples of that in Mark. Slightly more academic point is something called inclusio, which a scholar called Born applied to the Gospels. And an inclusio, basically, is where an ancient writer introduces a character by name, writes from that character's perspective, using that character's information, and then ends the character by mentioning their name, and then goes on to talk about a different character and using that character's perspective. This can be debated, but Borkham sees an inclusio, a bracketing of Peter's perspective between Mark 1 and Mark 16, so basically across the entire Gospel, written from Peter's perspective, and Borkham suggests using Peter as source material. So that's one up on the screen. Next one, Matthew. Matthew was one of Jesus' disciples, a tax collector from Capernaum, and also probably known as Levi in other. Besides his calling, he doesn't actually feature much in his Gospel or indeed the other Gospels, although he has a little more detail in his own words, we'll see. So Matthew's Gospel is given the epithet, the title of a tax collector. He doesn't have that in the other Gospels. In Matthew's Gospel, Matthew is called Matthew throughout, rather than Levi sort of changing to Matthew in Acts, if you're Luke. And also the account of his calling is slightly more detailed in Matthew than in Mark or Luke. John, as far as I'm aware, doesn't mention it at all. So that's Matthew. I should mention this is only hinting at who wrote it. We can't know it for certain, but given that it seems fairly probable. Luke, then. Luke was a doctor, a fellow worker with Paul, as Philemon puts it, and a physician, a doctor. He was possibly a Gentile. Certainly his name is Greek, not Jewish, and his Gospels and style are viewed as the least Jewish, and the writing is viewed as quite polished Greek, apparently. And this non-Jewishness, if it is indeed Luke, is reflected in his language. So, for instance, the other Gospels talk about the Sea of Galilee, but Luke, if indeed he is either a Hellenized Jew or Gentile from outside the area, knows that the Sea of Galilee is actually a lake, so he calls it a lake. It also matches with Luke, because Luke was with Paul, and Luke's account of the Last Supper matches Paul's in 1 Corinthians. So it has a little bit more detail than the other Mark and Matthew. There's also a suggestion of Luke using an inclusio, using a bracketing again, from women's perspective. So there's quite a lot of Luke. So from chapter 8 to chapter 24, Luke writes from the women's perspective, often referencing them. As with Matthew, Luke also uses quite a bit of Mark. And that could be viewed as an issue, because it could be viewed as undermining the independence of the Gospel accounts. But actually, could suggest that from the very early days of the church, Mark was viewed as authoritative. So Matthew was a disciple, he was an eyewitness, he was with Jesus, but he was willing to use Mark's text alongside his own experience. So actually, if anything, it shows that Mark was viewed as authoritative from the very early days. And lastly, John. John is slightly different to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and it's the most explicit about its authorship. The second last sentence says, this is a disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. So even though I said the gospel writers don't name themselves in the text, that's the closest we can get to a clear statement of authorship. So it seems quite likely that this beloved disciple, as he's elsewhere referred to in his gospel, was the principal source of that material, as his perspective is referenced throughout the gospel, and the gospel contains quite unique knowledge, such as the disciple admitting that he was known to the high priest and therefore able to get access to the courtyard during Jesus' trial. It's been suggested there's also an inclusio, also a writing from that disciple's perspective, basically throughout the gospel, so from John chapter 1 all the way up to John chapter 21. So, in summary, although one cannot prove or disprove the Gospel's traditional authors, and while this doesn't particularly affect their trustworthiness, the earliness of the ascriptions and the author's writing style and content suggest actually those ascriptions are quite likely the case. Their content, their text, also hints at the sources that they used, which is particularly important in the case of Mark and Luke, who may not have been eyewitnesses themselves. Now further, and most importantly, are the contents actually reliable? This is the real clincher. So the previous questions affect reliability, but this one really determines it. And I mentioned I studied this a bit at university. Most of the academics I studied under did not believe that the Gospels were historically reliable. The first seminar I had on the topic, we went into this room, and the professor whispered theatrically, some Christians actually believe this is true. It slightly challenged the stereotype of the younger generation when he discovered a few minutes later that about half the cohort that were doing that paper actually believed that it was God's word and was historically reliable and could, we hope, defend it. But from my reading, it seems that such academics are in the majority, particularly at universities. And it can be quite tempting in fields of historical reliability and in faith just to go with the flow. Again, at university, I had a friend who I was talking to about this, and he said, I've read the Wikipedia page. The Wikipedia page says the Bible is not historically reliable, therefore nothing you can say can change my mind. So it's tempting to go with the flow, but it's not particularly robust. And there is something to be said about the argument that such academics tend to use. It does seem, to me at least, to be quite circular. Most non-Christian academics do not believe the Gospels are historically trustworthy. After all, if they did, they'd probably be a Christian. But as a result, they don't tend to analyse the Gospels texts as seriously as they would historical texts. Instead, academics often apply external theories to them. We'll look at two now and think about them together. They can provide really interesting insights to the Gospel. Source criticism has been very helpful. We're going to talk about form criticism just for a moment, which dominated a lot of 20th century scholarship on the reliability of the Gospels. Its focus was on how the Gospels came together, how they were constructed. And the techniques that they used were designed to match those that were used to analyse folk tales. So tales that had developed over centuries, were passed down by word of mouth. So, form critics would look at the Gospels and look for evidence that the Gospels were transmitted by word of mouth over a very long time. And of course, they found it. But by selecting this technique, the academics had effectively approached a question with an answer already in mind. And form criticism already is pretty out of fashion in the academic world. So while that theory's gone, others have sprung up to take its place. We'll touch briefly on academics looking for anti-Semitism in the Bible. Bart Ehrman, who's quite a famous critical analyst of the Bible, notes that historians have found several examples of anti-Semitism in the Bible, such as the inclusion in Matthew's Gospel. The crowd, Jesus' trial, said, "Let Jesus' blood be on us and on our children." Ehrman took this, therefore, to be a later addition and evidence of increasing anti-Semitism in the early church. If that is indeed the case, that would challenge both the reliability of the Gospels and indeed challenge Christianity as a whole. But that's only one interpretation of that verse. It doesn't fit particularly well with the otherwise very Jewish nature of Mark's Gospel, and it overlooks all the other different interpretations of that verse, one of which, for instance, is that that verse foreshadows the fall of the temple in 70 AD. So by putting text below his theory, overlooks all the different alternative readings and critically weakens his own case. A digression on Winnie the Pooh. The circularity of this logic reminds me of a book that my old landlord used to have and I used to enjoy reading. It's called, I don't know if you know it, it's called The Pooh Perplex, in which this writer decides to impose a number of literary theories on the classic book to show this circularity, to show that you tend to reach the conclusions you go looking for with your theory. Here he is analysing Winnie the Pooh from a Marxist point of view. Rabbit is the capitalist manager par excellence, the captain of industry, who, having deceitfully offered Pooh admittance to his overstocked larder, artfully traps his victim in the doorway and exploits him as an unsalaried towel rack for an entire week. The united efforts of a Marxist-Leninist band of workers succeed in extricating Pooh from his servitude. So the point that this writer's making, slightly tongue-in-cheek, is that if you view Winnie the Pooh from a Marxist point of view, you will get a Marxist conclusion. The same is true of the Bible. If you approach it from a certain theoretical perspective, you will find evidence of that. So what then is the alternative to that circularity? It would be certainly wrong for me to respond by just offering my own theoretical perspective that supports my point of view. The Gospels were written in the style of historical biography, so it's worth giving them time and actually analysing them from the perspective of historical biography and making sure they actually match up with what we would expect. This is an absolutely vast topic. Some of it is very niche, and I only want to present information to you tonight that I can understand and you can understand, and we can actually check for ourselves in our Bibles. So, for instance, there's a fascinating argument about, I think, the ancient sycamore tree and the fact that the Gospel writers use the specific Greek for that sycamore. But unless we've got any ancient sycamore experts, those sort of examples I'm trying to steer clear of. But something we can check for ourselves in our Bibles are names. This might seem a slightly curious feature to look at, but it helpfully puts the Gospel's writing in a certain time and place. Richard Malcolm again made a study of this, comparing the frequency of names in the Gospels to the frequency of names in the other 3,000 references to Palestinian names of that time period. I've copied his table for male names up here, and you see there's a really good positive correlation between the popularity of names in Palestine at that time and the popularity or frequency of names in the Gospels. So you can see Simon is the most popular name, the most frequent name in the New Testament, and Simon is the most frequent name in those Palestinian sources of that time. And it's a big data set, 3,000 names. I should also mention, this point cannot be made beyond Palestine. So if the Gospels were, say, written later by Jewish people outside Palestine, the frequency of names do not fit. Borken did an alternative study for Egypt and the Jewish people there, So this further suggests an early date to the Gospels, and that characters haven't been added over time, or that it wasn't written outside Palestine. And this frequency of names is further supported by the Gospel writers using specific names for people. If I can go on a slight Barthampton digression for a moment, those who haven't been to our church before don't know one of our big issues as the church, which is we have far too many Ians. One of them has helped us by not coming tonight and instead being on holiday, but we've got two of them tonight. So we've got Ian Williams, Ian White, and Ian Lewis. Now, I sometimes have to take notes on various things, and it's fine because I can say Carl said this or Sally said that, but whenever it's an Ian, I have to go and write out it's Ian Williams said that or Ian Lewis said that. So we have to specify which Ian we're talking about. And the same's true in the Gospels. Rarer names aren't specified because they're rare, but Simon, which as you can see is most popular name in the New Testament and also in Palestine at the time, is specified. There's actually more than 3 different Simons in the Bible, but I could find 3 different Simons in the Gospels. And they're all specified. So you've got Simon Peter, Simon and Cyrene. So the Gospels were clearly written by people who knew the specific names of the people were being called at the time. Incidentally, this is one of the criticisms of the other Gospel accounts that didn't make it into the Bible. The most detailed of them is the Gospel of which theologically doesn't fit with the rest of the Bible due to various passages, but also names people just like their stock characters. So it has just 8 people in it, as opposed to the numerous people in the Gospels, and many of them aren't specifically named, like Mary. Well, which Mary? There's loads of Marys in the Gospels. Or Salome, I know of at least 2 Salomes in the Gospels. And his disciples are just called his disciples. This suggests that the Gospel of Thomas, and indeed the other Gospels like it that didn't make it into the Bible, were not written by eyewitness testimony, but after the other Gospels were well known, and the Gospel of Thomas and others could include them simply as stock characters that his audience would know and recognize. If I could stick with names for just a moment, specifying names gets particularly interesting with Jesus himself, and actually suggests that the speech we have in the Gospels is accurately passed on. Now, this is particularly important because the text of the Gospels can be the eyewitness's own words. And indeed, we see slight variations between Mark, Matthew, and Luke when they're talking about the same things, and John. But quotations need to be quotations. Now, if you look at the text of the 4 Gospels, Jesus is almost always called Jesus. Well, it's his Gospel, it's obvious which Jesus is being referred to. And also there aren't really any other Jesuses in the Gospels, with the potential exception of Barabbas at one specific point. Therefore, from the hundreds of uses of Jesus in the text, I could only see it being specified twice, which is once at the start of Matthew, once at the start of Mark, and that's when the Gospel writers are making the point that it's Jesus the Messiah. However, the opposite is the case in speech. I counted Jesus being named in speech 23 times in the Gospels, and his name is specified every single time, such as Jesus of Nazareth, or Jesus the son of Joseph, etc. Because in a crowd or in a group, you would need to specify which Jesus you're talking to. The one exception to that is when they come back from Jesus' tomb and say he's not in it, because what other Jesus would be in Jesus' tomb? So again, that suggests that the quotations have been accurately transmitted by someone who remembers that what Jesus was called at the time. So while that's just one element of textual analysis, the Gospel writers' use of names suggests accurate transmission from the time, situates their writing in the correct time and space, and particularly helpfully suggests quotations were accurately passed on. The other thing I want to look at is undesigned coincidences, which is something I find really, really interesting. If we took different statements about an event, we'd expect them to support each other directly, but also implicitly in undesigned ways. Now, I drove here with my wife Hilla tonight, and if we wrote accounts of the journey, they'd match each other up, but they'd match in subtle ways as well. So I might say it was quite a cold night when we were driving here. Hilla might say we drove past someone wearing a very nice coat. And those two accounts matched together implicitly. It was a cold night, so people were wearing coats, or vice versa. People were wearing coats because it was a cold night. They matched together, but in a way that's not designed. There's an old writer, a Victorian writer called J.J. Blunt, who was very interested in this and did a whole book on them across the entire Bible. He was writing in the 1800s. Many more examples have been found since, but he alone counted 32 examples from the Gospels where they'd match up in seemingly undesigned ways. We'll look at just two examples now, one from the start of the Gospels, one from towards the end. And the first example we're looking at is Jesus calling his disciples. Jesus writes that, Luke writes that Jesus instructs the first four disciples to fish from the other side of their boat. The disciples' nets break because there's so many fish, and then Jesus calls them to follow him. Mark, for whatever reason, wanted to be briefer in his account. He doesn't mention the haul of fish or the nets breaking. He just mentions that James and John, two of the four, were busy mending their nets when Jesus calls them. This matches up with Luke's account. If your nets broke, surely the next thing you'd do would be tending or mending them, trying to fix them. Skipping over his next 30 examples, the second example we're going to look at is a personal favourite of mine because actually they match together, but also John's account expands and explains the other one. So we'll start with Matthew. This is Peter's denial. So Peter is sitting out in the courtyard, is challenged by a servant girl, denies Jesus, goes into the gateway, and then he's again challenged. That probably strikes you as a bit strange. Why is Peter sitting outside in a courtyard? And why, after denying Jesus, does he choose to go in to the gateway? Surely he'd just want to get out. John's account explains all this. John was known to the high priest, so John went in, leaving Peter outside. John spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the gate, then went and brought Peter in. And then at the gateway, presumably this is the second challenge Peter faced, Peter is challenged. So John's account matches up with Mark's account, as well as explaining some of its more confusing elements. Now, unfortunate instances have been challenged most commonly by the suggestion that they can only be explained away because the Gospels, if the Gospels relied on common sources. But actually, that's, when you think about it, not really a counter at all. The four Gospels are each thousands of words long, so these early sources, if they are written, would have to be even longer. The Gospels, as we've seen, were within living memory of Jesus' life. So these early sources would have to be really, really early. And it strikes me that the only real explanation of this, unless there's some mega gospel that's ridiculously early that's for some reason been lost, the best example is the fact, as Luke says, that they went and spoke to eyewitnesses who could give them a huge quantity of details from very, very early on. So that's understanding coincidences, and we've only considered two arguments, textually, for the trustworthiness of the Gospels. But we can see there's an extremely robust case for the four biblical Gospels to have been literally transmitted from Jesus' life to their time of writing, and with no significant change from that point. So last but not least, so what? Well, first, the text of the Gospels, leaving quite loaded and circular theories aside, strongly suggests that the Gospels are indeed historically trustworthy. Most academics accept that they were written within the memory of Jesus' life. They show an understanding of Jesus' life that is exceptionally detailed, far more so than other non-biblical accounts. They fit together really well, explicitly, but also implicitly in undesigned ways. Together, that suggests there is very little change over time, either from Jesus' life to the point of writing, or since. And that's led me, many of you, billions of Christians over the centuries, to conclude that the Gospels are historically reliable. As I mentioned at the start, the implications of this are huge, because the claims of Christianity are huge. It's really easy to approach the Gospels with prior assumptions, particularly about their more supernatural elements, such as Jesus rising from the dead. But just like the earlier film critics and others, we need to take real care not to reach our answer before posing our question. If the Gospels are trustworthy, as I indeed believe, they merit really close examination with a keen eye and an open mind. And by extension, so do the life-changing claims of Christianity. I imagine John T will say a few words in a minute, but this is a really apt time of year to explore Christianity, as many churches around Bath, including here, are holding extra events, particularly with those who would not say they're Christians, in mind. And I hope such churches and such events will support you as you continue to explore this really important topic further.